The crystal wine glasses caught the restaurant's soft lighting as Naomi Williams balanced the heavy tray against her hip. Her feet ached in the required black heels, and the starched white blouse felt stiff against her skin after 10 hours on shift. The upscale establishment demanded perfection from its staff, and Naomi had learned to move with practiced grace between tables filled with people who saw her as invisible. Table 12 was different tonight. 4 men in expensive suits had been nursing their wine for over an hour, their voices growing louder with each glass. The one at the head of the table she'd overheard someone call him Richard had been glancing in her direction all evening. Not the appreciative look she sometimes received, but something calculating and cold. Naomi approached with fresh bread, her professional smile firmly in place. These were the moments that required the most strength, serving people who looked through her as if she were nothing more than furniture that happened to move. "More wine, gentlemen?" she asked, her voice warm despite the exhaustion creeping through her bones. Richard Hoffman, tech millionaire and tonight's host, barely glanced at her before launching into rapid German. His companions leaned forward, anticipating entertainment. "Look at this one," he said in fluent German, gesturing dismissively toward Naomi. "Probably never been outside this city. I bet she thinks those shoes make her look sophisticated." The table erupted in laughter. Naomi's hand tightened imperceptibly on the wine bottle, but her expression remained neutral. Years of working in high-end establishments had taught her to endure worse than this. "Her accent," continued Richard's business partner, Thomas, also in German, "so common. I wonder if she even finished high school." "Doubtful," Richard replied, warming to his audience. "These service workers, they're all the same. No education, no culture, no real understanding of the world. She probably thinks our conversation is about business deals." Another wave of laughter rippled around the table. Naomi carefully poured wine into each glass, her movements steady and professional. Inside, something was building, not anger, but a calm determination that had carried her through much darker times than this. "I particularly love," Richard continued in German, clearly enjoying himself, "how she carries herself like she belongs somewhere better. The delusion is almost charming. As if putting on a uniform could change what she really is." Thomas nodded appreciatively. "It's remarkable, isn't it? The complete lack of awareness. She has no idea we're discussing her right now. Probably assumes we're talking about stock prices or mergers." "The American education system," added the third man, Heinrich, raising his glass, "produces such limited minds. One language, one perspective, one very small world." Naomi finished pouring and stepped back, still maintaining her professional demeanor. The fourth man, Klaus, decided to join the game. "Richard, you should ask her something in German. Watch her look confused and nod like she understands. These types always pretend to be more sophisticated than they are." Richard's eyes lit up with malicious amusement. He looked directly at Naomi and spoke in German, his voice dripping with false courtesy. "Excuse me, miss. My friends and I were just discussing how refreshing it is to meet someone so authentic, so genuinely representative of her background and circumstances. We find your simplicity quite entertaining." The entire table watched expectantly, waiting for confusion to cross her features, for the blank smile of someone pretending to understand. They waited for her to nod politely and retreat, confirming every assumption they'd made about her intelligence, her background, her worth. But Naomi didn't retreat. She didn't look confused. Instead, she set down the wine bottle with deliberate precision and straightened her shoulders. The exhaustion in her eyes was replaced by something sharper, something that made Richard's confident smirk falter slightly. For 15 years, Naomi had bitten her tongue. Through college while working 3 jobs, through graduate school when professors dismissed her research, through auditions where she was told she didn't fit their image. She'd smiled through humiliation at dozens of restaurants, accepted dismissive comments about her intelligence, her background, her dreams. But tonight something was different. Maybe it was the particular cruelty in Richard's voice, or the way his friends had joined in like hyenas circling prey. Maybe it was thinking about her mother lying in a hospital bed, waiting for treatments they couldn't afford. Maybe it was simply that she'd had enough of being invisible to people who assumed their money made them superior. The moment stretched between them, tension building like the pause before lightning strikes. Richard's expression shifted from amusement to uncertainty as he registered the change in her posture, the intelligence blazing in her eyes that he'd somehow missed before. Naomi took a breath and made a decision that would change everything. The silence at table 12 stretched like a held breath. Naomi could feel every eye in the restaurant beginning to turn their way, sensing the shift in atmosphere even if they couldn't understand its source. Richard's confident expression wavered as he found himself truly looking at her for the first time all evening. When Naomi spoke, her German was not just fluent, it was flawless, carrying the precise articulation of someone who had learned the language not from textbooks but from native speakers, from years of immersion and genuine love for its complexity. "How refreshing indeed, Mr. Hoffman, to encounter such authentic ignorance so elegantly displayed in public," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet section of the restaurant. "Your discussion of American education is particularly fascinating coming from someone who clearly never learned that respect and intelligence aren't purchased with money." The color drained from Richard's face. Thomas choked slightly on his wine. Heinrich's mouth fell open in shock. Only Klaus had the presence of mind to look embarrassed. But Naomi wasn't finished. Years of suppressed dignity poured into her words, each syllable delivered with the precision of someone who had spent countless hours perfecting pronunciation, understanding nuance, appreciating the beauty of a language these men were using as a weapon. "Your assumption about my education is understandable," she continued in perfect German, her tone now taking on the quality of a professor delivering a lecture. "After all, you've demonstrated that wealth can certainly purchase university degrees but apparently cannot buy the wisdom to recognize intelligence in others. I earned my master's degree in Germanic literature from Columbia University, writing my thesis on Rilke's later sonnets in German, naturally." The restaurant had grown noticeably quieter. Other diners were beginning to stare, sensing drama unfolding. The maitre d' started moving in their direction, but Naomi's composed demeanor suggested no intervention was needed. "As for my background," she said, allowing a slight smile to play at the corners of her mouth, "I spent 3 years in Vienna studying classical violin performance. I lived with a German family, the Müllers, who became my second parents. Frau Müller taught me to make spatzel from scratch while we discussed Goethe's color theory. Her husband and I spent Sunday afternoons debating the philosophical implications of Kant's categorical imperative." Richard looked as if he'd been struck. The transformation in his understanding was visible. The woman he'd dismissed as uneducated service help was revealing herself to be more cultured and sophisticated than he'd ever suspected. "But perhaps most relevant to tonight's conversation," Naomi continued, her voice taking on a warmer tone that somehow made her words more devastating, "is that my grandmother emigrated from Bavaria in 1958. I learned German at her kitchen table, listening to her stories about the old country while she taught me to make Apfelstrudel. She always told me that a person's character shows most clearly in how they treat those they believe to be beneath them." The silence that followed was deafening. Every assumption the men had made lay shattered on the white tablecloth like broken glass. Thomas was staring at his hands, Heinrich had gone pale, and Klaus looked genuinely ashamed. Richard, however, was undergoing a more complex transformation. The shock in his expression was giving way to something that looked almost like admiration. He was seeing Naomi completely differently now, not just as someone he'd misjudged, but as someone who had handled his cruelty with a grace and intelligence that left him feeling small and ignorant. He began, then stopped, clearly struggling to find words adequate to the situation. "You thought you were entertaining your friends at my expense," Naomi said gently, switching back to English. "But you've actually provided me with something quite valuable, a clear demonstration of why my grandmother's lessons about character were so important." The maitre d' had arrived at the table, clearly concerned about the disturbance, but Naomi turned to him with her professional smile restored. "These gentlemen were just complimenting my service," she said smoothly. Mr. Hoffman was particularly appreciative. Richard found his voice. "Miss? I'm sorry, I don't know your name." "Naomi Williams," she replied, her dignity intact despite everything that had happened. "Miss Williams, Richard stood awkwardly, his expensive suit suddenly seeming like costume jewelry next to her natural poise. "I owe you the most sincere apology. My behavior tonight was inexcusable." For a moment, Naomi studied his face. She could see genuine remorse replacing the earlier arrogance, and something else, a spark of respect that hadn't been there before. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, "Forgiveness isn't about them labeling. It's about you choosing not to carry their poison." "Apology accepted, Mr. Hoffman," she said with quiet grace. "We all make mistakes when we forget to see each other as human beings." "No," Richard said firmly, and there was something different in his voice now, determination mixed with what might have been the beginning of genuine admiration. "An apology isn't enough. Would you allow me to make this right? To show you the respect I should have shown from the beginning?" Naomi considered this. Her practical side whispered that refusing would be satisfying but ultimately pointless. Her grandmother had also taught her that when someone genuinely wants to make amends, grace lies in allowing them the chance to do better. "What did you have in mind?" she asked. "Dinner," Richard said immediately. "Not here, not while you're working. Somewhere you can be a guest, treated with the dignity you deserve. Please, let me prove that I can be better than what you saw tonight." The three other men at the table watched this exchange with fascination and growing respect for both parties. Naomi's handling of the situation had been masterful, and Richard's response showed more character than his initial behavior had suggested. Naomi looked at Richard for a long moment, seeing not the cruel man who had mocked her 20 minutes ago, but someone who seemed genuinely shaken by his own behavior and determined to make amends. "All right, Mr. Hoffman," she said finally. "I accept your invitation." The relief on his face was unmistakable. "Thank you. When would be convenient for you?" "I'm off tomorrow evening," she replied. "Perfect. I'll pick you up at 7 if that works." "That works," Naomi agreed, then returned to her professional mode. "Now, can I get you gentlemen anything else this evening?" As she walked away from the table, carrying herself with the same quiet dignity she'd shown throughout the encounter, Richard watched her go with an expression that was part admiration, part bewilderment, and part something deeper that he wasn't quite ready to name yet. Naomi stood before her small apartment's mirror, adjusting the simple black dress she'd borrowed from her roommate. It was the nicest thing in either of their closets, and she'd spent the last hour making sure every detail was perfect. Not because she wanted to impress Richard Hoffman, but because she'd learned long ago that dignity was often a choice in how you presented yourself to the world. The knock on her door came at exactly 7 o'clock. When she opened it, Richard stood there looking unexpectedly nervous, holding a bouquet of white roses. "These are for you," he said, offering the flowers with an awkwardness that was endearingly different from his confident cruelty the night before. "I wasn't sure what kind you'd prefer, but roses seemed appropriate for an apology." "They're beautiful," Naomi said, accepting them graciously. "Let me put these in water and I'll be right with you." As she arranged the roses in her only decent vase, Richard glanced around her tiny apartment. It was clean and organized, with books everywhere stacked on shelves, piled beside the small sofa, even lined up along the windowsill. Classical music posters covered one wall, including a photograph of her in formal concert attire, violin in hand. "Is that you?" he asked, pointing to the performance photo. "Carnegie Hall," Naomi replied simply, not elaborating. 3 years ago. Richard stared at the image with something approaching awe. The woman in the photograph was radiant, completely transformed by music, holding her violin like it was an extension of her soul. It was a far cry from the tired waitress he'd dismissed so cruelly. The car ride to the restaurant was initially awkward, filled with Richard's attempts at small talk and Naomi's polite but reserved responses. She wasn't making this easy for him, and he was beginning to understand that forgiveness wasn't the same as forgetting. The restaurant he'd chosen was the most exclusive in the city, Le Bernardin, where reservations were typically booked months in advance. As they were seated at the best table in the house, Naomi couldn't help but notice the irony. "You realize," she said with a slight smile, "that I probably served someone very similar to you at a place just like this last week." Richard had the grace to look embarrassed. "I've been thinking about that all day. About how many people like you I've probably dismissed without a second thought." "People like me?" Naomi raised an eyebrow. "No, that came out wrong," Richard said quickly. "I mean, people who were clearly intelligent, accomplished, deserving of respect, but whom I ignored because of their circumstances or their jobs or my own assumptions." The waiter approached ironically, a young man who looked not unlike the staff at the restaurant where they'd met. Richard made a point of addressing him by name, asking about his evening, treating him with obvious respect. Naomi noticed. "What made you change your approach?" she asked after they'd ordered. Richard was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. "Honestly, you scared me last night." "Scared you?" "Not in a threatening way," he clarified quickly. "But you made me see myself clearly for the first time in years. The man who was speaking in German last night? I didn't recognize him. Or maybe I did, and that's what scared me." Naomi studied his face. There was genuine distress there and something that looked like shame. "Tell me about him," she said softly. "I built my first company when I was 25, Richard began, his voice taking on a confessional quality. "Tech startup, nothing fancy, but it succeeded beyond my wildest dreams. Then the second company, then the third. Each success made me more insulated. More certain that my wealth meant I was smarter, better, more deserving than other people." He paused as their appetizers arrived, then continued. Somewhere along the way I stopped seeing service workers as people. They became scenery, background noise in my important life. And last night? Last night I wasn't just dismissive. I was cruel. I turned your dignity into entertainment for my friends. He looked directly at her now, his eyes serious. That wasn't just wrong, Naomi. It was evil. The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. She'd expected defensiveness, justification, maybe even subtle attempts to minimize what had happened. Instead, he was taking full responsibility and then some. What do you want from me, Richard? She asked. Nothing, he said immediately, then reconsidered. No, that's not true. I want to understand how someone handles humiliation the way you did. I want to know what shaped you into someone who could respond to cruelty with such grace. Naomi considered whether to answer honestly. Something in his expression convinced her to try. My mother is dying, she said quietly. Richard's face went pale. I'm sorry, I didn't know. Lupus, Naomi continued. Diagnosed 5 years ago. The treatments are expensive, and insurance doesn't cover everything. I've been working 3 jobs to pay for her care while trying to keep my music career alive. 3 jobs. The restaurant where you met me, private violin lessons on weekends, and I play weddings when I can get them. She met his eyes steadily. So when wealthy men mock my shoes or my accent, it doesn't devastate me the way it might someone else. I know who I am and what I'm fighting for. Richard was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. What can I do? About what? Your mother. The medical bills. All of it. He leaned forward intensely. I have resources, Naomi. Let me help. Naomi's first instinct was to refuse. She'd been independent for so long, fighting every battle alone. But then she thought about her mother's tired face during their last hospital visit, about the bills stacking up on her kitchen table, about the treatment options they'd had to rule out because of cost. Her grandmother's voice whispered in her memory, pride is a luxury, Liebling. When someone offers genuine help, accepting it gracefully is sometimes the braver choice. You do that? She asked carefully. Help with her medical expenses? Without hesitation, Richard replied immediately. Consider it the beginning of making amends. Naomi felt tears threatening for the first time since this whole encounter began. Yes. Thank you. I accept your offer. The relief and gratitude in her voice seemed to affect Richard profoundly. He reached across the table and gently touched her hand. Thank you for letting me help, he said. And thank you for giving me the chance to be better than I was last night. As their dinner continued, the conversation flowed more naturally. Richard asked thoughtful questions about her music, her education, her dreams. Naomi found herself sharing stories about Vienna, about her grandmother's recipes, about the small moments that had shaped her into who she was. What would you do, Richard asked over dessert, if money wasn't an issue? If your mother's care was completely covered and you could focus entirely on music? Audition for the symphony, Naomi replied without hesitation. It's been my dream since I was 12 years old. Richard smiled, the first genuinely warm expression she'd seen from him. Then that's what you're going to do. By the time he drove her home, something fundamental had shifted between them. The cruel stranger from the restaurant had been replaced by someone thoughtful, generous, and genuinely interested in making amends through action, not just words. Thank you for tonight, Naomi said as they stood outside her apartment building. Thank you for accepting my apology, Richard replied. And for showing me who I want to be. As she watched his car disappear down the street, Naomi realized that sometimes the most unexpected encounters could open doors you never knew existed. The call came at 9 in the morning, 3 days after their dinner. Naomi was preparing for her shift at the restaurant when her phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Miss Williams? This is Dr. Patterson from Mount Sinai Medical Center. I'm calling about your mother's treatment plan. Naomi's heart clenched. Is everything all right? Is she? Oh, she's fine, Dr. Patterson assured her quickly. I'm calling with very good news, actually. Her entire treatment plan has been covered by an anonymous benefactor. All of it, the specialized medications, the experimental therapy we discussed, even the physical therapy sessions. Naomi sank into her kitchen chair, overwhelmed. I don't understand. How much are we talking about? The total coverage is approximately $250,000, Dr. Patterson said matter-of-factly. Whoever arranged this wanted to ensure your mother has access to the absolute best care available. After hanging up, Naomi sat in stunned silence for several minutes. Then she called the restaurant and asked for the day off. She had a visit to make. Richard's office building was a gleaming tower of glass and steel in Midtown Manhattan. The receptionist in the marble lobby seemed surprised when Naomi asked to see Mr. Hoffman without an appointment, but after a brief phone call, she was escorted to an elevator that whisked her to the 42nd floor. Richard's assistant, a polished woman named Jennifer, led her to a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. Richard stood as she entered, looking both pleased and nervous to see her. "Naomi, what a wonderful surprise. $250,000, she said without preamble. Richard had the grace not to pretend ignorance. "Dr. Patterson called you." "Why?" Naomi asked, though tears were already forming in her eyes. "Why would you do something like this?" "Because I could," Richard replied simply. "Because your mother deserves the best medical care available and because—" He hesitated, then continued with quiet intensity. "Because when I saw you handle my cruelty with such grace, I realized I wanted to be part of something good instead of something ugly." Naomi walked to the windows, looking out over the city while she composed herself. When she turned back, her decision was clear. "I accept," she said. "With more gratitude than I can possibly express, I accept your generosity." Richard's relief was visible. "There's more if you're willing to hear it." "More?" "I made some calls yesterday. The New York Philharmonic is holding auditions next month for their violin section. I know the music director and I mentioned your background. He'd like to hear you play." Naomi stared at him. "You got me an audition with the Philharmonic?" "I got you the opportunity to audition," Richard corrected. "What happens after that depends entirely on your talent, which from what I've researched is considerable." She had seen his eyes light up when he mentioned her performance history, and now she understood why. He had clearly spent time investigating her background, learning about her achievements, understanding the scope of what she'd accomplished despite her circumstances. "You researched me," she said, not accusingly but with curiosity. Richard looked slightly embarrassed. "I wanted to understand who I'd been so cruel to. What I found was humbling. Carnegie Hall wasn't just a one-time performance, was it? You were a regular featured soloist with 3 different orchestras in Europe." "That was a different life," Naomi said quietly. "Why did you leave it?" "My mother got sick. I came home to care for her." She met his eyes steadily. "Music is wonderful, but family is everything." The simple statement seemed to affect Richard deeply. "I haven't spoken to my parents in 2 years, he admitted. "We had a disagreement about business and I decided they weren't worth my time." "That's not the same thing," Naomi said gently. "My mother needed medical care. Your parents probably just needed their son." Richard was quiet for a long moment. "You're right. Add that to the list of things I need to fix." "Lists can be overwhelming," Naomi suggested. "Maybe just focus on one thing at a time." "Speaking of which," Richard said, seeming to come to a decision, "there's something else I'd like to offer, but I want to be very clear that it's separate from everything else. Not payment for forgiveness, not charity, just something I think would benefit both of us." "What is it?" "I'm starting a foundation focused on supporting working artists. Musicians, painters, writers, people who have talent but need financial stability to pursue their art. I need someone to run it, someone who understands both the artistic side and the practical challenges." Naomi felt her heart begin to race. "You're offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a career," Richard replied. "Full salary, complete creative control, and the resources to make a real difference in artists' lives. What do you think?" The opportunity was beyond anything she'd dared to dream. Running an arts foundation would combine her passion for music with her desire to help others facing the same struggles she'd endured. It would provide financial security while keeping her connected to the artistic community she loved. "I think," she said carefully, "that it sounds too good to be true." "It's not," Richard assured her. "I've been planning this foundation for months, but I couldn't find the right person to run it. Someone with artistic credibility, practical experience, and the moral compass to do it right. After meeting you, I realized I'd been looking in all the wrong places." Naomi studied his face, looking for any sign of manipulation or hidden agenda. What she saw instead was genuine enthusiasm and what appeared to be growing respect for her abilities. "I accept," she said finally. "With gratitude and excitement, I accept." Richard's smile was transformative. "Excellent. Jennifer will have the paperwork ready by tomorrow, and we can start planning the foundation's launch immediately." As Naomi prepared to leave, Richard walked her to the elevator. "There's one more thing," he said as they waited for the doors to open. "Richard, you've already done more than enough." "Not a gift this time," he interrupted gently. "A question." Would you be willing to have dinner with me again? Not as part of an apology, not as business partners, but just because I'd like to spend more time getting to know you. The question hung in the air between them. Naomi could see the vulnerability in his expression, the genuine hope mixed with uncertainty. Something had shifted during their conversation. The dynamic between them had evolved from guilt and forgiveness to mutual respect and what might be the beginning of genuine friendship. I'd like that, she said honestly. As the elevator doors closed, Naomi caught sight of Richard's reflection in the polished metal. He was smiling with what looked like pure joy. For the first time since this whole encounter began, she found herself smiling too. The foundation of something new was being built between them. Something that had nothing to do with cruelty or apologies and everything to do with two people discovering they might actually enjoy each other's company. The audition room at Lincoln Center felt both familiar and foreign to Naomi as she unpacked her violin case with careful, practiced movements. It had been 3 years since she'd performed in a space like this, 3 years since music had been anything more than background accompaniment to wealthy people's dinner conversations. Richard sat in the back of the small auditorium, having arrived early to ensure he could witness this moment. He tried to convince himself his presence was about supporting the foundation's future director, but the truth was more complex. Over the past 2 weeks as they'd worked together planning the Arts Foundation, he'd found himself increasingly fascinated by Naomi's intelligence, her passion for helping other artists, and the graceful way she approached every challenge. The audition panel consisted of 3 musicians from the Philharmonic, including music director Alan Gilbert himself. They looked up expectantly as Naomi positioned her violin and took a moment to center herself. "Miss Williams," Gilbert said formally, "please begin with the Bach piece whenever you're ready." Naomi lifted her violin and closed her eyes briefly. When she began to play, the transformation was immediate and startling. Gone was any trace of the tired waitress or even the composed professional from their foundation meetings. This was Naomi in her element, completely absorbed in the music flowing through her. The Bach partita filled the room with crystalline precision, each note perfectly placed yet somehow spontaneous and alive. Richard found himself holding his breath, understanding for the first time the magnitude of talent that had been hidden beneath uniforms and circumstances. When she moved into the Brahms concerto, the emotional depth of her playing became even more apparent. This wasn't just technical excellence, this was storytelling through strings, painting pictures with bow and fingertips. The audition panel exchanged glances that Richard interpreted as impressed surprise. But it was during her final piece, a haunting rendition of Pachelbel's canon that she'd clearly interpreted through her own artistic lens, that Richard truly understood what he was witnessing. This was what Naomi had sacrificed to care for her mother, what she'd given up to work 3 jobs and pay medical bills. This was her gift to the world, and the world had been missing it. When the last note faded, the silence in the room was profound. Then Gilbert began to smile. "Miss Williams," he said standing up, "that was extraordinary. We'd like to offer you the position immediately." Naomi's professional composure cracked slightly, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "You mean?" "Second violin section to start, with opportunities for solo performances based on merit," Gilbert continued. "Full salary, benefits, and a seat with one of the world's finest orchestras." "I accept," Naomi said immediately, her voice bright with joy. "With enormous gratitude, I accept." Richard found himself applauding from the back of the room, his excitement for her success surprising him with its intensity. As the audition panel congratulated Naomi and discussed start dates and repertoire, he waited patiently for his chance to speak with her. "How does it feel?" he asked as they walked out of Lincoln Center together. "Like coming home," Naomi replied honestly. "I'd forgotten what it feels like to play for people who understand music, who can appreciate the subtleties and the emotion behind the notes." "Your foundation work won't suffer, will it?" Richard asked, though his tone suggested he wouldn't mind if she needed to adjust her responsibilities. "Actually, I think it will make me better at the job," Naomi said thoughtfully. "I'll be working with active musicians, understanding their current challenges, staying connected to the artistic community we're trying to support." They walked in comfortable silence for several blocks before Richard spoke again. "I have a confession to make." "Oh." "I've been looking forward to tonight's dinner all week, and it has nothing to do with business or foundations or making amends for past behavior." Naomi glanced at him sideways, noting the slight nervousness in his expression. "What does it have to do with?" "With the fact that I find you fascinating," Richard admitted. "Your intelligence, your grace under pressure, your passion for music and helping others. I keep finding excuses to extend our meetings because I enjoy talking with you." They'd stopped walking now, standing on a quiet side street as evening settled over the city. Naomi studied his face, seeing vulnerability there that was entirely different from his earlier guilt and remorse. "Richard," she said carefully, "are you saying you're interested in me romantically?" "I'm saying," he replied, "that somewhere between." "I'm saying," he replied, "that somewhere between your response in German and watching you play today, I've developed feelings that go far beyond professional respect or the desire to make amends." Naomi felt her heart skip slightly. Over the past few weeks, she'd noticed the way Richard looked at her during their foundation meetings, the way he seemed to hang on her words when she talked about music, the genuine joy on his face when good things happened to her. She'd been trying to ignore the growing warmth in her chest whenever he smiled. "I need to be honest with you," she said finally. "A month ago I would have said this was impossible. You were the cruel stranger mocking me in a language you thought I couldn't understand. And now I see who you really are when you choose to be your best self," Naomi replied. "And I like that person very much." Richard's face lit up with hope. "Does that mean you'd be willing to explore where this might lead?" "I think," Naomi said with a small smile, "I'd like that very much." The dinner that night was different from their previous meals together. The conversation flowed naturally from music to books to travel, revealing shared interests and complementary perspectives. Richard talked about his love of classical architecture, his secret dream of learning to play piano, his regret about losing touch with the creative side of his personality as his business success grew. Naomi shared stories about her time in Vienna, the small moments of beauty that sustained her through difficult periods, her hopes for what the foundation could accomplish for struggling artists. She talked about her mother's influence on her character, her grandmother's wisdom, the way music had always been her compass through life's challenges. "What's your favorite piece to play?" Richard asked over dessert. "It depends on my mood," Naomi replied thoughtfully. "When I'm sad, I play Bach because the mathematical precision comforts me. When I'm angry, Paganini helps me channel that energy. When I'm happy—" "What do you play when you're happy?" "Mozart. Specifically, his Violin Concerto No. 4. It's pure joy translated into music." "Will you play it for me sometime?" Richard asked. "At my first Philharmonic performance," Naomi promised. "It's on the program for next month's concert." "I'll be there," Richard said immediately. "Front row if they'll let me." As he drove her home that night, Naomi reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this point. From humiliation to forgiveness to respect to something that might be love, it seemed impossible that so much could change in such a short time. "Naomi," Richard said as they sat outside her apartment building, "I want you to know that everything I've done for you, your mother's medical care, the audition opportunity, the foundation position, none of it was meant to obligate you to anything. Your feelings, whatever they might be, need to be completely separate from my attempts to make amends." "I know," she replied softly. "And that's part of why I'm beginning to trust what I feel for you." Richard reached across the car and gently took her hand. "What do you feel?" Naomi looked down at their joined hands, surprised by how natural the contact felt. "Like maybe the universe has an odd sense of humor," she said with a small laugh. "And like maybe I'm falling for someone I never expected to care about." When Richard walked her to her door, they stood for a moment in the soft light from the hallway, both aware that something significant was shifting between them. "Good night, Naomi," Richard said softly. "Good night, Richard," she replied. As he leaned down to kiss her cheek, Naomi turned slightly, and their lips met instead. The kiss was gentle, tentative, but filled with promise. When they separated, both were smiling. "I'll see you tomorrow for the foundation meeting?" Richard asked. "Wouldn't miss it," Naomi confirmed. As she watched him drive away, Naomi realized that for the first time in years, she was looking forward to tomorrow not just because of what she needed to accomplish, but because of who she'd get to spend time with. The foundation of their relationship was solid now, built on honesty, mutual respect, and genuine care for each other's well-being. Music was returning to her life, but so was the possibility of love. The foundation's temporary office buzzed with activity as Naomi coordinated interviews with potential grant recipients. In just 3 weeks, she'd established application processes, created evaluation criteria, and scheduled their first round of artist consultations. Richard watched from his desk across the room, constantly amazed by her efficiency and compassion. "Mr. Chin is here for his 2 o'clock appointment," Jennifer announced from the doorway. Naomi looked up from her notes. "Perfect. Could you show him to the conference room? I'll be right there." As she gathered her materials, Richard noticed the small furrow of concentration between her eyebrows that appeared whenever she was deeply focused on helping someone. It was one of dozens of small details about her that he'd found himself cataloging over the past month. "How many applications are we up to now?" he asked. 47 in 3 weeks, Naomi replied, her excitement evident. "Musicians, painters, sculptors, dancers, writers. The need is even greater than we anticipated. And our budget can handle that many grants?" "Not all of them, unfortunately," Naomi said, her expression growing serious. "That's the hardest part of this job, having to choose between equally deserving artists." Richard made a mental note to increase the foundation's funding. Watching Naomi's genuine distress over having to turn anyone away made the decision automatic. The afternoon flew by with back-to-back artist interviews. Richard found himself joining several of them, ostensibly to understand the foundation's work better, but really because he loved watching Naomi interact with creative people. She asked insightful questions, offered practical advice, and somehow managed to make every artist feel heard and valued, even those they couldn't immediately help. "You're a natural at this," he told her as they wrapped up the day's sessions. "It helps that I've been exactly where they are," Naomi replied, organizing her notes with characteristic precision. 5 years ago, I would have given anything for someone to believe in my work enough to offer financial support." "Speaking of believing in your work," Richard said, pulling an envelope from his desk drawer, "these came today." Naomi opened the envelope to find reviews from her first Philharmonic performance the week before. The critics had been unanimous in their praise, with one calling her a luminous new voice in classical music, and another describing her playing as technically flawless and emotionally transcendent. "Richard, these are incredible," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "Listen to this one, Amos. Williams brings a rare combination of European sophistication and American soul to her interpretations, creating something entirely fresh while respecting classical traditions." "My favorite is the Times review," Richard said, unable to hide his pride. "The part where they said watching you play Mozart was like witnessing pure joy given physical form." Naomi looked up from the papers, tears threatening. "I can't believe this is real. 6 months ago, I was serving tables and wondering if I'd ever play professionally again." "It's real because you made it real," Richard said firmly. "Your talent, your perseverance, your refusal to give up on your dreams even when circumstances were against you. Your help didn't hurt," Naomi said softly. "I opened a door," Richard replied. "You're the one who walked through it and made magic happen." They developed an easy rhythm of working together during the day and having dinner most evenings, sometimes discussing foundation business but more often simply enjoying each other's company. Tonight, Richard had suggested cooking at his apartment instead of going out. Richard's penthouse was exactly what Naomi had expected: tasteful, expensive, and slightly impersonal. But she noticed small changes since her first visit: fresh flowers on the dining table, classical music playing softly in the background, a stack of books about music history on the coffee table. "You've been reading about music," she observed, picking up a biography of Yo-Yo Ma. "Trying to understand your world better," Richard admitted, looking slightly embarrassed. "I realized I've spent my whole adult life focused on technology and business. I wanted to learn about something that matters to you." The gesture touched her more than expensive gifts would have. "What do you think so far?" "I think I've been missing out on something profound," Richard replied honestly. "The way musicians talk about their craft, the dedication required, the emotional vulnerability of performing, it's completely different from the business world." "Different how?" "In business, vulnerability is weakness. In music, it seems to be strength." Naomi smiled. "That's very perceptive. Music requires you to open yourself completely to the audience, to share not just technical skill but emotional truth." "Is that scary?" Richard asked as he moved around the kitchen, preparing their meal with surprising competence. "Terrifying," Naomi admitted. "Every time I step on stage, I'm essentially saying, 'Here's my heart, please don't break it.' But you do it anyway. Because the alternative is not sharing the music at all, and that would be worse than any critical review." They worked together in comfortable silence, Naomi chopping vegetables while Richard handled the main course. The domestic simplicity felt natural, as if they'd been cooking together for years rather than weeks. "Can I ask you something personal?" Richard said as they sat down to eat. "Of course. What made you forgive me so completely? Not just that first night, but really forgive me? I see how you look at me now, and there's no trace of anger or resentment." Naomi considered the question carefully. "My grandmother used to say that holding on to anger is like clutching a hot coal, you're the one who gets burned. But beyond that, I think I saw who you really were underneath the cruelty." "What did you see?" "Someone who was genuinely shocked by his own behavior," Naomi replied. Someone who didn't just apologize but completely changed his actions. Someone who, when given the chance to do better, consistently chose kindness. Richard reached across the table and took her hand. I need you to know that everything I feel for you now is separate from guilt or gratitude. This isn't about making amends anymore. What is it about? Naomi asked, though she could see the answer in his eyes. It's about the fact that you're the most remarkable person I've ever met, Richard said simply. Your strength, your compassion, your talent, the way you handle every challenge with grace. It's about wanting to be part of your life not because I owe you something, but because being with you makes me want to be the best version of myself. Naomi felt her heart racing. Richard. I'm falling in love with you, Naomi, he said quietly. I've been for weeks now. And I needed you to know that it has nothing to do with guilt or obligation and everything to do with who you are as a person. The honesty in his voice, the vulnerability in his expression, made Naomi's remaining reservations crumble. I'm falling in love with you too, she admitted. Which terrifies me because 6 months ago I couldn't have imagined caring about someone who hurt me the way you did. And now I can't imagine my life without you in it, she said softly. Richard brought her hand to his lips and kissed her palm gently. Then don't. Let me be part of your life, your dreams, your music. Let me love you the way you deserve to be loved. Naomi looked into his eyes and saw not the cruel stranger from the restaurant, but a man who had proven through consistent actions that he was capable of profound change and genuine love. Yes, she said simply. When Richard kissed her this time, it was different from their previous gentle encounters. This kiss held promise, commitment, and the kind of deep emotion that changes everything it touches. As they held each other in the soft light of his apartment, both knew they'd crossed a threshold from which there would be no going back. What had begun in humiliation had transformed into something beautiful, something worth fighting for, something that felt like home. The Foundation's first official board meeting was scheduled for a crisp October morning, and Naomi arrived early to ensure everything was perfect. Over the past 2 months, they'd awarded grants to 15 artists, established partnerships with 3 local music schools, and gained recognition from the mayor's office for their community impact. Richard was already in the conference room, reviewing presentation materials when she entered. He looked up with a warm smile that had become as familiar to her as morning coffee. Ready for the big day? He asked, standing to greet her with a brief kiss that still made her heart flutter after 6 weeks of officially being a couple. As ready as anyone can be for their first major board presentation, Naomi replied, smoothing her navy dress, another purchase made possible by her Philharmonic salary. Are you nervous? About the board meeting? No. About your reaction to something I want to propose afterward? Absolutely. Naomi raised an eyebrow. Should I be worried? Hopefully excited, Richard said mysteriously. But let's get through the meeting first. The board meeting exceeded all expectations. The 5 board members, including 2 prominent arts patrons, a former symphony conductor, and a successful gallery owner, were impressed by Naomi's detailed reports on grant recipients, her strategic vision for expanding their reach, and her passionate advocacy for supporting working artists. Miss Williams, said board member Patricia Kellerman, a renowned arts patron, your presentation has been exceptional. The Foundation's impact in just 2 months is remarkable. Thank you, Naomi replied graciously. But this is just the beginning. With proper support, we could triple our grant offerings and establish satellite programs in other cities. About that, Richard said, glancing around the table, I have a proposal that I think will interest everyone. He stood and moved to the front of the room, his expression serious but excited. I'm prepared to commit an additional $10 million to the Foundation's endowment, with one condition. The room went silent. Naomi stared at him in shock. $10 million would transform the Foundation from a local charity into a major national organization. What's the condition? Asked board member James Morrison. That Naomi agrees to become the Foundation's permanent executive director, with complete creative and operational control, a salary commensurate with running a major nonprofit, and the authority to expand our mission nationwide. All eyes turned to Naomi, who was still processing the magnitude of what Richard had just proposed. Richard, I don't know what to say. Say yes, urged Patricia Kellerman. With that kind of funding and your vision, this foundation could revolutionize support for working artists across the country. The salary alone would be life-changing, added James Morrison. You'd never have to worry about financial security again while doing work you're passionate about. Naomi looked around the table at faces filled with excitement and expectation, then at Richard, whose expression was carefully neutral despite the intensity in his eyes. "I accept," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "With enormous gratitude and excitement, I accept this opportunity." The room erupted in applause. Richard's carefully maintained composure cracked into a grin of pure joy. As the board members congratulated Naomi and began discussing implementation timelines, she found herself overwhelmed by the scope of what had just happened. After the meeting, as the board members filed out discussing celebration dinners and press releases, Naomi and Richard remained in the conference room. $10 million, she said, still somewhat stunned. "Richard, it's an investment in something I believe in completely," he interrupted. "Your vision, your compassion, your ability to make a real difference in people's lives. Are you sure this isn't just because you love me?" Naomi asked carefully. Richard moved closer, taking her hands in his. "I love you completely, yes. But I propose this because you're the most qualified person I've ever met to run an organization like this. Your artistic background, your understanding of financial struggle, your natural leadership abilities, you're perfect for this role. It's going to mean travel, long hours, probably less time for my own music career." "Only if you want it to," Richard said quickly. "The board position comes with complete flexibility to maintain your Philharmonic commitments. We can hire staff to handle day-to-day operations while you focus on vision and strategy." Naomi walked to the window, looking out over the city where she'd struggled for so many years. "A year ago, I was serving tables and wondering how to pay my mother's medical bills. Now you're offering me the chance to run a $10 million foundation. Life has a way of surprising us," Richard said softly, joining her at the window. "The question is, does this feel right to you?" Naomi turned to face him, seeing in his expression nothing but support and genuine belief in her abilities. "It feels like destiny," she admitted. "Like everything that happened, including that awful night at the restaurant, led to this moment." "So you're happy with the decision?" "I'm ecstatic," Naomi said, throwing her arms around his neck. "Thank you for believing in me this completely." Richard lifted her off her feet in a spinning hug. "Thank you for being someone worth believing in." As they held each other in the empty conference room, both understood that this moment represented more than just professional advancement. It was the culmination of a transformation that had started with cruelty and grown into something beautiful through forgiveness, respect, and genuine love. "There's one more thing," Richard said as they prepared to leave. "More? I don't think my heart can handle any more surprises today." "This one's smaller but more personal," Richard said, pulling a small velvet box from his jacket pocket. Naomi's breath caught. "Richard, it's not what you think," he said quickly, then smiled. "Well, not exactly what you think. It's a promise ring. A promise that when you're ready, whenever you're ready, I want to spend the rest of my life loving you and supporting your dreams." He opened the box to reveal a simple but elegant band with a single, perfect diamond. "No pressure, no timeline, just a promise that my love for you isn't going anywhere." Naomi looked at the ring, then at Richard's face, seeing nothing but patience and adoration there. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Will you wear it?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "I'll wear it and I'll treasure what it represents." As Richard slipped the ring onto her finger, Naomi realized that acceptance had become her superpower. Accepting his apology had led to friendship. Accepting his help had restored her music career. Accepting his love had brought joy she'd never thought possible. And now, accepting this ring felt like accepting a future filled with possibilities she'd never dared to imagine. "I love you, Richard," she said softly. "I love you too, Naomi," he replied. "More than I ever thought possible." Walking out of the building together, hand in hand, both felt the solid foundation of trust and respect they'd built, supporting the beautiful structure of love growing between them. The Foundation's first annual gala was set for a crisp December evening at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Naomi had spent weeks coordinating every detail, from the menu featuring foods from grant recipients' cultural backgrounds to the performance schedule showcasing artists they'd supported throughout the year. Richard watched from across the room as she moved gracefully between guests, ensuring everyone felt welcomed and valued. In her midnight blue gown, a gift from him that she'd accepted with grateful delight, she looked radiant, completely in her element as the Foundation's leader. "She's remarkable," said Patricia Kellerman, appearing beside Richard with a glass of champagne. "She is," Richard agreed, unable to hide the pride and affection in his voice. "You know, when you first proposed this foundation, I wondered if your motivation was entirely professional," Patricia continued with a knowing smile. "Now I see it was about recognizing extraordinary talent and character." "Both," Richard admitted honestly. I fell in love with her intelligence and grace long before I admitted I was falling in love with her. The evening's highlight was Naomi's performance of Mozart's Violin Concerto No. 4, the piece she told him she played when happy. As the first notes filled the museum's great hall, the crowd of 200 guests fell into reverent silence. Richard had heard Naomi play dozens of times by now, but tonight felt different. Tonight, as she performed the piece she associated with pure joy, he could see in her face and posture a happiness that seemed to radiate outward, touching everyone in the room. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. But Richard only had eyes for Naomi as she gracefully acknowledged the crowd, her face glowing with the satisfaction of sharing her gift with people who appreciated it. "Thank you," she said as the applause died down. "Music has the power to transform lives, and thanks to your support, we've been able to help other artists share their gifts with the world. Tonight, we celebrate not just the foundation's success, but the incredible creativity and resilience of the artists we serve." More applause followed, but Richard noticed Naomi's eyes seeking him out in the crowd. When their gazes met, her smile became more personal, more intimate, meant just for him. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations, donor conversations, and celebration. By the time the last guest departed, both Richard and Naomi were exhausted but exhilarated. "I think we can call that a success," Naomi said, sinking into a chair in the museum's now empty great hall, her high heels discarded beside her. "A resounding success," Richard agreed, loosening his bow tie as he sat beside her. "The foundation raised over $2 million tonight. We have commitments for 3 new partnerships, and you absolutely mesmerized everyone with your performance." "I felt different tonight when I played," Naomi mused. "More connected to the music, more joyful. Like everything in my life was finally in harmony." Richard turned to face her fully, struck by the contentment in her voice. "What's changed?" Naomi considered the question, absently twisting the promise ring on her finger. "Everything really. A year ago I was struggling just to survive. Tonight I'm running a major foundation, playing with one of the world's finest orchestras and I'm completely, utterly in love with a man I never thought I could trust, let alone care about." The simple honesty of her statement took Richard's breath away. They'd been together for 4 months now, but this was the first time either of them had used the word love, without qualification or hesitation. "Naomi," he said softly, reaching for her hands. "I need to tell you something," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "That first night when you offered to take me to dinner, I almost said no. Not because I didn't think you were sincere, but because I was afraid of caring about someone who had hurt me." "What changed your mind?" "My grandmother's voice in my head, telling me that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is give someone the chance to be better than they were in their worst moment." Richard brought her hands to his lips, kissing her palms gently. "I'm grateful every day that you were brave enough to give me that chance." "I'm grateful you proved worthy of it," Naomi replied. "Richard, what we have together, it's not what I expected love to feel like." "How did you expect it to feel?" "Desperate, uncertain, like walking on unstable ground. But this feels solid. Safe. Like coming home to myself." Richard stood and pulled her up with him, wrapping his arms around her in the empty museum hall where she just performed so beautifully. "I love you, Naomi Williams," he said clearly, letting the words fill the space between them. "I love your strength, your compassion, your incredible talent. I love the way you handle challenges with grace and how you make everyone around you want to be better. I love that you gave me the chance to prove I could be worthy of your respect and affection." "I love you too, Richard Hoffman," Naomi replied, her voice steady and sure. "I love your generosity, your willingness to change and grow, the way you support my dreams without trying to control them. I love that you saw who I really was even when I was hidden behind circumstances and uniforms." They kissed then, surrounded by the echoes of music and applause, in a space dedicated to preserving beautiful things. It was a kiss that sealed something between them, that marked the transition from 2 people falling in love to 2 people who had fallen and were ready to build something lasting together. "There's something I want to ask you," Richard said as they separated. "Another surprise? I'm not sure my heart can take much more excitement today." Richard smiled, but his expression was serious. "Move in with me. Not because it's practical or convenient, but because I want to wake up every morning knowing you're there. I want to share daily life with you, the boring Tuesday evenings and the Sunday morning coffees and everything in between." Naomi felt her heart expand with possibility. "You're sure? Living together is different from dinner dates and foundation meetings." "I've never been more sure of anything," Richard replied. "I want all of it, Naomi. The good days and the difficult ones, The times when you're practicing at 5 in the morning and the times when foundation work keeps you up until midnight. I want to be part of your real life, not just the highlight reel. Looking into his eyes, Naomi saw not just love but partnership, not just attraction but genuine friendship and respect. Yes, she said simply. I want that too. As they stood together in the museum's great hall, surrounded by art and history and the lingering beauty of the evening's music, both understood that they were creating something precious together. What had begun in humiliation and grown through forgiveness had blossomed into a love that felt both passionate and enduring. Should we go home? Richard asked softly. We should, Naomi agreed, but neither moved for a long moment, both wanting to remember this perfect ending to a perfect evening. When they finally gathered their things and walked out into the December night, they did so hand in hand, hearts full of love and anticipation for all the tomorrows waiting ahead of them. 6 months later, Naomi stood in the kitchen of Richard's penthouse, their penthouse now, preparing coffee and reviewing her schedule for the day. The foundation had grown to support over 100 artists across 12 cities, her role with the Philharmonic had expanded to include solo performances, and her mother's health had stabilized completely thanks to consistent, excellent medical care. Richard emerged from the bedroom, adjusting his tie for an important board meeting, and paused to watch Naomi in the morning light. She wore one of his shirts over leggings, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, completely absorbed in her planning notes. The sight of her in their shared space, comfortable and focused, still made his heart skip. Good morning, beautiful, he said, wrapping his arms around her from behind and kissing her neck. Good morning, Naomi replied, leaning back against him. Coffee's fresh and I made those blueberry muffins you like. You didn't have to do that. Mrs. Patterson could have. I wanted to, Naomi interrupted, turning in his arms. I like taking care of you sometimes. It was true. Despite having a housekeeper and a cook available, Naomi often chose to prepare small meals or tidy their space herself. It was an obligation but choice, finding joy in creating a home together rather than simply sharing an expensive apartment. What's your day looking like? Richard asked, accepting the coffee cup she offered. Morning rehearsal for next week's concert, lunch meeting with potential board members for the foundation's West Coast expansion, then dinner with your parents. Richard's relationship with his parents had been completely transformed over the past months, largely due to Naomi's gentle encouragement to reconnect with them. What had started as awkward coffee meetings had evolved into regular family dinners and genuine affection. They adore you, you know, Richard said. Mom called yesterday just to make sure you were still planning to come to their anniversary party next month. I love them too, Naomi replied honestly. They raised an extraordinary man, even if it took him a while to figure out how to show it. Richard smiled at her assessment. Speaking of extraordinary, how are you feeling about the Times interview this afternoon? Naomi's success with the foundation had attracted national media attention, including a feature profile in the New York Times about her transformation from struggling waitress to arts leader. The interview was scheduled for that afternoon. Nervous but excited, she admitted. It's still surreal sometimes being asked to speak as an expert on arts funding and musician support. You are an expert, Richard reminded her firmly. You've lived it, studied it, and now you're changing it for hundreds of other artists. The truth of his statement still amazed Naomi sometimes. The foundation now employed 12 full-time staff members, had partnerships with major orchestras in 6 cities, and had been recognized by the National Endowment for the Arts as a model for innovative artist support. Richard, she said suddenly, do you ever think about how different our lives would be if you hadn't made those comments in German that night? Every day, he replied immediately. And every day I'm grateful you responded the way you did instead of simply walking away. What do you think would have happened if I'd just ignored you? Richard considered this seriously. I probably would have continued being an arrogant ass who dismissed people based on their circumstances. You would have continued struggling without support. Neither of us would have discovered what we could become together. No foundation, no reconciliation with your parents, no music career for me. No love, Richard added softly. No partnership, no shared dreams, no mornings like this one. Naomi reached up to straighten his tie, a gesture that had become routine but still carried intimacy. I'm glad you were awful that night. That's a terrible thing to say, Richard laughed. But true. If you'd been polite and dismissive instead of cruel and dismissive, I wouldn't have had the motivation to respond. We would have remained strangers living completely separate lives. So you're saying my worst moment led to our best life? I'm saying, Naomi replied, kissing him softly, that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the most unlikely soil. That evening, after a successful day of rehearsals and meetings, they met Richard's parents at their favorite restaurant. The elder Hoffmans, initially skeptical about their son's relationship with someone from such a different background, had been completely won over by Naomi's intelligence, warmth, and positive influence on Richard. "How's the foundation expansion going, dear?" Richard's mother, Ellen, asked over appetizers. "Better than expected," Naomi replied enthusiastically. "We're opening offices in Los Angeles and Chicago next month, and we have applications from over 300 artists for our next grant cycle." "That's wonderful," Richard's father, William, said with genuine pride. "You've created something truly meaningful." "We've created something meaningful," Naomi corrected, glancing at Richard. "This has been a partnership from the beginning." Richard's parents exchanged a look that Naomi had learned to recognize the pleased surprise of parents watching their child in a healthy, supportive relationship. "Speaking of partnerships," Ellen said with careful casualness, "have you two given any thought to making yours more official?" Richard nearly choked on his wine. "Mom?" "It's a reasonable question," William added with a grin. "You've been together almost a year, you're living together, building a business together. Some people might call that marriage without the paperwork." Naomi felt her cheeks warm but answered honestly. "We've talked about it. We both want the same future, we're just not in any hurry to formalize what already feels complete. Besides," Richard added, reaching for Naomi's hand, "I'm still trying to convince her that I'm worthy of a lifetime commitment." "You convinced me of that months ago," Naomi said softly, squeezing his fingers. The conversation moved on to other topics, but Naomi noticed Richard seemed distracted for the rest of the evening. During the drive home she finally asked about it. "You've been quiet since dinner. Everything okay?" "Perfect," Richard replied, but his tone suggested something was on his mind. "Just thinking about what my parents said." "About marriage?" "About making our partnership official," Richard clarified. "Not because we need external validation but because, Naomi, what we have is the most important thing in my life. I want everyone to know that we're committed to each other permanently." Naomi studied his profile as he drove through the city lights. "Are you saying you want to get married?" "I'm saying I want to marry you," Richard replied, his voice gaining certainty. "I want to promise in front of everyone we care about that I'll love and support you for the rest of our lives. I want you to have my name if you want it, and I want legal recognition of our partnership." "Richard." "I know the promise ring was supposed to be no pressure," he continued, "but Naomi, I can't imagine my life without you. I don't want to imagine it." Naomi felt tears threatening, not from sadness but from overwhelming happiness. "Pull over," she said quietly. "What?" "Pull over. I need to look at you when I say this." Richard found a parking spot along Central Park and turned to face her, his expression vulnerable and hopeful. "Richard Hoffman," Naomi said clearly, "are you asking me to marry you?" "Yes," he replied without hesitation. "I'm asking you to marry me, to build a life with me, to be my partner in everything for as long as we both live." Naomi reached up to cup his face in her hands, seeing in his eyes the same love, respect, and commitment she felt in her own heart. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you." The kiss they shared in the car overlooking Central Park was different from all their previous kisses. It carried the weight of forever, the promise of a shared future, the joy of two people who had found in each other not just love but home. As they held each other in the soft light of the street lamps, both marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. From that awful night in the restaurant to this perfect evening in their car, they had built something beautiful together through honesty, forgiveness, and genuine care for each other's happiness. "I love you, future Mrs. Hoffman," Richard whispered against her hair. "I love you too, future husband," Naomi replied, her heart full of joy and anticipation for all the tomorrows they would share. The morning of their wedding day dawned bright and clear, with September sunlight streaming through the windows of the bridal suite at the Plaza Hotel. Naomi sat in her silk robe, surrounded by her bridesmaids, her college roommate, two fellow Philharmonic musicians, and Richard's sister, who had become a close friend over the past year. "You look absolutely radiant," said Jessica, Richard's sister, as she helped secure Naomi's veil. "I've never seen my brother this happy, you know. You've transformed him completely." Naomi smiled at her reflection, seeing not just a bride but a woman who had traveled an incredible journey to reach this moment. The wedding dress, a classic ivory gown with delicate beadwork, had been her choice, elegant but not ostentatious, reflecting the refined simplicity that had become her style. "Are you nervous?" asked her maid of honor Lauren as she handed Naomi her bouquet of white roses and baby's breath. "Surprisingly, no," Naomi replied honestly. I feel peaceful. Like everything has led to this moment exactly as it was supposed to. Across the hotel, Richard was having a very different experience. His hands shook slightly as he attempted to tie his bow tie for the third time, finally accepting help from his best man and business partner, James. Relax, James said with amusement. You're marrying the woman you love, not facing a hostile takeover. I know, Richard replied, running a hand through his hair. I just want everything to be perfect for her. She deserves perfection. She deserves you, corrected his father, entering the room with a warm smile. And you deserve her. Stop overthinking and start celebrating. The ceremony was held in the plaza's terrace room, decorated with white roses and soft candlelight. As guests began to arrive, a carefully curated mix of family, close friends, foundation board members, and fellow musicians, the atmosphere filled with joy and anticipation. Richard stood at the altar, his nervousness replaced by pure happiness as he watched the processional begin. But when the doors opened for Naomi's entrance, everything else disappeared. She walked down the aisle with confidence and grace, her mother now healthy and beaming with pride at her side. The woman who had once served him wine while he mocked her in German was now approaching him as his equal, his partner, his bride. When she reached the altar, Richard took her hands and whispered, "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." "You clean up pretty well yourself," Naomi replied with a soft smile that made him laugh despite his emotion. The ceremony proceeded beautifully, with personal vows that brought tears to many eyes. Richard spoke about transformation, forgiveness, and finding love in the most unexpected place. Naomi talked about grace, second chances, and building something beautiful from difficult beginnings. "You may kiss the bride," announced the officiant, and Richard did so with gentle reverence, sealing their union with a kiss that felt like coming home. The reception that followed was elegant but warm, filled with music, laughter, and celebration. Naomi performed a special piece, Pachelbel's Canon, the same piece she'd played at her Philharmonic audition, dedicating it to Richard as her wedding gift to him. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Richard and Naomi found themselves alone for a moment on the hotel's terrace, looking out over Central Park. "Mrs. Hoffman," Richard said, testing out her new name. "I love the sound of that," Naomi replied, adjusting her wedding ring, a simple platinum band that complemented her engagement ring perfectly. "Any regrets?" Richard asked, pulling her close. "None," Naomi said firmly. "This has been the most perfect day of my life." "Good," Richard said, "because I have something I need to tell you, and I want you to know how happy I am first." Naomi pulled back to look at him, noting something different in his expression. "What is it?" Richard took a deep breath. "I know about the research." Naomi felt her heart skip. "What research?" "I know that after that first night at the restaurant, you researched me thoroughly before our dinner date. I know you learned about my company, my background, my interests, even my parents' names and occupations." The color drained from Naomi's face. "Richard, I know you planned your responses during our early conversations to appeal to what you'd learned about my personality and values," Richard continued gently. "I know our connection wasn't entirely spontaneous." Naomi stared at him, her mind racing. "How did you find out?" "Your laptop was open one morning about 3 months ago. I saw the browser history from that week in January, tech industry profiles, articles about my company, even background information about my family." "Why didn't you say anything then?" Richard smiled softly. "Because by then it didn't matter. By then I knew that whatever had started as strategy had become genuine." Naomi felt tears forming. "I need to explain." "You don't need to explain anything," Richard interrupted. "But I'd like to understand." Naomi took a shaky breath, her composure finally cracking. "That night at the restaurant, after you humiliated me, I was angry. Not just hurt but furious. When you offered to take me to dinner, my first instinct was to refuse. But you didn't." "No, because I realized I had an opportunity. Here was this wealthy, arrogant man who had underestimated me completely. I thought maybe I could teach him a lesson." Richard nodded encouragingly. "So you researched me. Everything I could find. Your company's mission statement, interviews where you talked about your values, your parents' background, your interests. I wanted to understand what would make you respect me. And then I planned our dinner conversation carefully. I knew that mentioning my grandmother's German heritage would intrigue you after my response in German. I knew that talking about my mother's illness would appeal to your family values. I knew that discussing music history would show intellectual compatibility." Richard was quiet for a long moment. "You manipulated me." "I did," Naomi admitted, tears now flowing freely. At first. But Richard, somewhere during that dinner it stopped being strategy and started being real. When you offered to help with my mother's medical bills, when I saw genuine remorse in your eyes, when you asked about my dreams, that's when I stopped calculating and started feeling. When did you know you loved me? The night you attended my first Philharmonic performance, Naomi replied without hesitation. I looked out into the audience and saw you watching me with such pride and joy, and I realized that whatever had started as a calculated response to cruelty had become the most real thing in my life. Richard reached up to wipe her tears gently. Do you think I'm angry? Aren't you? I'm impressed, Richard said with a growing smile. You identified exactly what kind of person I was and what would reach me. You showed strategic intelligence that most business people would envy. And you had the wisdom to let strategy evolve into genuine emotion. Naomi stared at him in amazement. You're not upset? Naomi, you took my worst moment and turned it into an opportunity to create something beautiful. You saw potential for change in someone who had been cruel to you. You were smart enough to plan an approach that would work and brave enough to let that plan become real love. But I deceived you. You outsmarted me, Richard corrected with admiration. And then you loved me. The woman I married tonight is brilliant, strategic, compassionate, and genuine. The fact that you initially approached our relationship with intelligence and planning doesn't diminish what we've built together. Naomi felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. I was terrified you'd feel like our entire relationship was built on a lie. Our relationship is built on truth, Richard said firmly. The truth that you're extraordinary, that I'm capable of being better than my worst moments, and that love can grow from the most unlikely beginnings. He pulled her close again, holding her as the last of her tears dried. Besides, he added with a hint of laughter, the fact that you could orchestrate such a perfect long-term strategy and then execute it flawlessly just makes me more certain I married the right person. You're really not angry? I'm grateful, Richard replied. Grateful that you were smart enough to see possibility where others might have seen only cruelty. Grateful that you gave me the chance to prove I could be worthy of your love. And grateful that you trusted me enough to let your strategic beginning become an authentic relationship. They stood together on the terrace, husband and wife now, looking out over the city where they'd met in such unlikely circumstances. The lights of Manhattan sparkled below them like possibilities made visible. So we're good? Naomi asked softly. We're perfect, Richard assured her. We're honest, we're committed, and we're starting our marriage with complete truth between us. Complete truth, Naomi agreed. No more secrets. No more secrets, Richard confirmed. Just love, partnership, and whatever adventures come next. As they kissed under the stars, both marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. What had begun with calculated strategy and genuine hurt had transformed into something neither had expected, a love based on mutual respect, shared values, and the profound recognition that they made each other better people. The wedding reception might have been ending, but their real adventure was just beginning. Together, they would continue building the foundation that supported other artists' dreams while creating a life filled with music, love, and the kind of happiness that comes from truly knowing and accepting each other completely. Ready to go home, Mrs. Hoffman? Richard asked as they prepared to leave the terrace. Ready for anything, Mr. Hoffman, Naomi replied, taking his hand as they walked toward their future together. In the end, the greatest revelation wasn't about strategy or manipulation, it was about the transformative power of two people choosing to see the best in each other and building something beautiful from that choice. Their love story had begun in the most unlikely way, but it would continue in the most natural way possible, with honesty, commitment, and joy.